We're here today at Trinity Methodist Church in Savannah, Georgia, with the pastor, Enoch Hendry, and we're here to learn a little bit about John Wesley in Savannah. Thanks for inviting us and letting us come and visit with you.
Delighted that you're here.
I guess for me, kind of to start talking about Wesley in Savannah, the crossing, whenever he was headed to Savannah and aboard the boat, the Simmons, and his meetings with the Moravians on board were kind of a starting point to me of his trip here, because it seemed to have really had a big impact on him.
It did. It had a significant impact, and subsequently was a galvanizing, transforming experience for Mr. Wesley. Of course, John and Charles traveled from England on the Simmons in 1735, arriving about 3 months later in February of 1735. During the course of the journey, the Simmons experienced some rough seas, and he came up on the deck of the ship. And he discovered German Moravians, 25 of them, on the deck of the ship, holding hands and singing hymns. They had an amazing calm about them, Mr. Wesley remarked. And he realized that they had a strong faith which allowed them to remain calm even in the face of a terrible storm. And it was something that he, even in that moment, yearned for. He yearned for that kind of faith.
So one of the things that happens early on as he arrives here, and I think you were telling me just a minute ago that his arrival was on an island near Tybee where you were within a miles of where you were a pastor prior to coming here.
Yeah, I was the pastor of Trinity Chapel United Methodist Church out on Tybee Island, coastal barrier island here off of the city of Savannah. And Mr. Wesley made landfall. The ship, the Simmons, stopped before sailing all the way up the Savannah River to the bluff that Mr. Oglethorpe had identified for the settlement of the colony. They made landfall, and Mr. Wesley disembarked from the Simmons, came ashore, and knelt for prayer. There's a monument there on Cockspur Island. At that time, it was known as Peepers Island by the British.
By the time he arrives in Savannah, he's already ordained. He's the son of Anglican cleric. He's been teaching at Oxford, but he kind of has this crisis of faith to some extent upon his arrival here, but he goes straight to work. What did he do whenever he was here in Savannah?
Well, of course, he was the rector of the Anglican community and serving offices for what is now Christ Church here in Savannah. Did not have that name at the time. Mr. Wesley found the Anglican community here not particularly to his liking. He was disappointed when he arrived in the congregation, and he set about to help them find a more disciplined approach to their faith. He was off-putting to most. He was not generally held in high regard almost immediately upon his arrival. He was, Mr. Wesley's personal disciplines didn't allow him the opportunity to win friends and influence people. And as I'm sure you know, he spent a certain period of time down with his brother Charles in St. Simon's in an effort to convert the Native Americans who were there on the island. He counted himself an abject failure in that endeavor, and that was one of the more disappointing, if not the most disappointing thing for Mr. Wesley during his time here in Savannah. His inability to make any headway at all in leading the Native Americans to a faith in Christ.
It seemed as if it was something that was a primary concern when he came, and then when he arrived, the Indians weren't as interested as he thought they would be, and Oglethorpe wasn't as interested in him leaving the community as he had expected.
That's right. And Mr. Oglethorpe's plans for Mr. Wesley in Savannah were different, as you suggest, than Mr. Wesley's own expectations of what he might be doing while he was here. Oglethorpe's intention was that Mr. Wesley would be pastor to the Anglican community here, and not much more than that.
So what kind of impact did he have here in Savannah?
As Mr. Wesley would later say, his time here was a failure. As he spoke about that, he was, I think, especially concerned and disappointed that he wasn't able to make any headway among the native community. As I said a moment ago, he was not held in particularly high regard. When Mr. Oglethorpe first established the colony, there was to be no slavery in Savannah, and no lawyers, as a matter of fact, but also no alcohol. Shortly after the colony was established, slaves not owned by Savannah residents, but slaves owned by Charleston residents were imported to do much of the heavy work in the colony. By the time Mr. Wesley arrived, spirits and slaves were present, and Mr. Wesley spoke immediately against both, and as an abolitionist was not deeply appreciated by local commerce. Mr. Wesley got on the wrong side of Savannah's leadership almost immediately in regard to those two issues, and his later difficulties were sort of charges against Mr. Wesley that were later brought were likely trumped up because of the fact that he was on the wrong side of economic leadership.
So there were some things that he did that kind of started practices that he would elaborate on as he returned to England and began the revival. He seemed to have, I think, worked on doing kind of small group study that kind of became the societies and classes and bands. It was kind of I think when he talks about the second coming of Methodism, my understanding is it's kind of what he's making reference to is what he did here in Savannah.
I'm not clear about that. I do know that not much of Mr. Wesley's work in Savannah survived him. There were the Methodist societies that were established upon Mr. Wesley's return, born of his heartwarming experience, were of a different sort than those that he established here in the colony. Again, Mr. Wesley's role here was as the rector of the Anglican community. While he did pay attention to classes, taught classical languages here during his time, as a matter of fact, a burgeoning Sunday school was something that Mr. Wesley paid attention to. But again, I don't believe that much of that survived him here in the city.
So what led to kind of the establishment of Methodism within the Savannah community?
Methodism actually came late to Savannah. The first Methodist church wasn't established in Savannah until 1812, even with Mr. Wesley's long history and association with the city. Methodism came late. Methodist societies began to form, and subsequently to the first Methodist church here in Savannah, established in 1812, and named Wesley's Chapel in honor of Mr. Wesley.
And out of Wesley's Chapel, did that provide the seeds for what later became Trinity Methodist?
It did. By 1840, the church was too small, and they began to consider the possibility of building a new church. In 1848, they bought the garden plot from the Telfair family. This is now Telfair Square, where Trinity Church is established. At the time, it was St. James Square, and the colonial governor lived on St. James Square. And the church approached the Telfair family and was able to purchase the garden plot from the Telfair family and built the church here. Construction was begun in 1848 and completed in 1850.
What does this church mean to you? You've been here serving as pastor for a while now?
I've been here 13 years, as a matter of fact, lucky 13. This congregation, as I was explaining to you earlier, the church had been in decline in a typical manner of inner city congregations. Church had been in decline for 20 or 25 years. When in 1991, the educational building where we're sitting right now was completely destroyed by fire. It was likely arson. It was never established whether it was random arson or malicious. A firefighter was killed during the battling of the blaze. He was killed when a fire hose, a defective fire hose exploded and slapped him in the chest. He died of internal injuries. Subsequent to the fire, the arson charges became murder charges because of the death of the fireman. The city of Savannah, because of liability related to the fire hose, the faulty fire hose, made several quick decisions to settle the case and appropriately provided appropriate compensation to the firefighter's family. But they dropped the arson investigation. That didn't satisfy the insurance company, who continued their own investigation without the support of the city of Savannah or the fire department or the local police department. So it took almost 2 years before the church was able to complete the rebuilding of the educational building and to move back into the sanctuary. So the church was the congregation out of the building for almost 2 years. They worshiped nearby in a funeral home chapel. Lost all of their staff, save the pastor during those years. And in 1993, the Reverend Dr. Ralph Bailey came to serve Trinity as he neared retirement, mostly as a mission enterprise. He felt a calling to come and help Trinity Church survive. During those years, they completed a visioning process, and by 2000, they had determined that they were going to stay and remain on Telfair Square, where they had been since 1848. And that became sort of the byword for the congregation, Trinity Church on Telfair Square since 1848. And it was that sense of place that led them to make some good decisions about staying here, became committed, a renewed commitment to the history of the church, the establishing of a museum here in the building. They didn't want the church to be a museum, but they wanted to honor their history. They also made some decisions about where their pastor would live, which led to the decision to convert the fourth floor of the educational building to a parsonage where their next pastor would live and where future pastors would live, so they could lay claim to their identity here on Telfair Square.
So living on Telfair Square is, in some respects, living kind of in an area that the Methodist Church has declared important historical place to our faith.
Yeah.
What is that like?
The Methodist Church did establish a shrine here in Savannah, including all of the places that have been identified as related to Mr. Wesley, where he preached his first sermon, where he lived during his time here. In Reynolds Square, on the east side of town, there's a statue to Mr. Wesley, and there is also information provided there about all those sites, including Cockspur Island and where Mr. Wesley lived. In 1995, this church began work to have Trinity Church, even though the church was built and established long after Mr. Wesley's time here, and the church was built after Mr. Wesley's death. The church was added to that shrine because of the beginnings of Methodism here in Savannah, and this church's connection to that.
What does that mean to you as kind of the leader of the faith community in this area that is so significant in America because of John Wesley?
It was, for me personally, it was a unique opportunity to come be the pastor of Trinity Church. I grew up in Savannah, and in my childhood, I remember connecting early Georgia history with the beginnings of the Methodist Church. That was something that connection was strong and clear to me in a way that I assumed it was to everyone. But it had to do especially with growing up in not just Georgia, but in local Savannah school systems and being able to make those kinds of connections. So coming back here and given the opportunity as I moved toward retirement to be the pastor of Trinity Church has been a unique blessing. And it is the church's identity as Mother Church of Savannah Methodism, the church's identity as a part of the Wesley Shrine here, which gives us not just a unique role within the South Georgia Conference of the United Methodist Church, but gives us the opportunity to welcome bishops and evangelists from all over the country who come to Savannah and want to see our museum and to take time to make the connection with Mr. Wesley.
What would you like people to take away or to learn from visiting the Wesley sites, from spending time at Trinity and thinking about Wesley? What is it that is important about Wesley that is important to Savannah and important to Trinity Church?
Mr. Wesley's vision for a strong church continues. When we were able to restore the exterior of the church building here in 2005, a rather significant enterprise for us, Dr. Bailey, my predecessor here, and I were out watching the scaffolding and the fencing being placed around the building. And we decided at that time there should be a banner letting people know that we were an active congregation and would be continuing to worship during the mostly year-long restoration. We had a banner placed on the fencing that protected visitors to the site. And the banner, thanks to Dr. Bailey, I said, "What should the banner say, Ralph?" And he thought about it for a moment, just standing out there. And seemingly off at the top of his head, he said, "Tested by war, plague, and fire, proven through time." And I do believe that's what I want people to take away, that the deep and abiding faith of the earliest Methodists in this city survives here on Telfair Square. And the hard work done by those Anglicans and later by Methodists to ensure a strong faith here in the city has survived.
Thank you so much for welcoming us into your church and sharing time with us and talking about John Wesley and his time here in Savannah, Georgia.
Glad that you would want to come. It's a joy to have the chance to have this conversation. Thanks very much.